Good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's Lung Cancer Living Room. For those of you who may not know me, and I think everyone in the room, well, mostly everyone in the room, not yet, but it's coming. I'm Danielle Hicks. I am Chief Patient Officer here at GO2 for lung cancer. But what that means is I'm responsible for overseeing an amazing team of people that provide support, education programs to all of those diagnosed with lung cancer. So I'm thrilled to have you all here in the room tonight. Thank you for joining us. We have Dr. Sarah Goldberg here tonight from Yale University, and she is a veteran to the Lung Cancer Living Room. It was 2018, maybe. We did one of our on-the-road living rooms out there at Yale, and we couldn't be more thrilled to have her here. This program was designed specifically with people diagnosed with lung cancer in mind to bring to you live and in real time information about what's happening right now in lung cancer. And I think for those of you who are familiar with the living room, you know that things are happening fast and furiously, which is very exciting. Cancer in and of itself, not so exciting, but the things that are happening in this space are. So welcome, 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 welcome to you. As you guys know, we're going to be discussing updates from ASCO, the American Society of Clinical Oncology. It occurs every year in late May, early June. It is a rat race of a conference covering all cancers. Obviously, when I attend this meeting, and I am attending specifically for lung cancer, but it's a really exciting time where we learn about the data that's emerging from the science and the clinical trials that I know some of you have been on, some of you are currently on, that are happening today. So we're really excited to update you guys on all of that. We're going to start with the early stage disease, what's going on there, which I know some of you have heard us talk about in the past. We're hoping to get more patients that fall within this bucket of early stage, and then we're going to jump into late stage, specifically as it relates to targeted therapies, immunotherapies, and others. So let's jump in. Let's start with early stage. Before we start, I want to make sure everybody understands a couple of words that will be used during this conversation, specifically neoadjuvant, adjuvant, and perioperative. So neoadjuvant is additional therapy given prior to surgery. Adjuvant is additional therapy given post-surgery, and perioperative is both before and after surgery. So if you hear us say those words tonight, that is what we are referring to. So Dr. Goldberg, I think what we want to start with is this targeted therapy space. There's been a lot of excitement around both the neoadjuvant and adjuvant sort of spaces of early stage disease. Maybe we can start a little bit with the Adura trial. We've covered that in the past, but what are some of the findings we've discovered sort of moving out and as we get further out from the original study?
This is probably one of the most, if not the most exciting studies that was presented at ASCO this year. The Adura study was an adjuvant therapy. So just as you very nicely explained, adjuvant is after surgery. So patients who got surgery, then they got chemotherapy if it was appropriate, and then they were randomized. So half of them got osimertinib, which is an EGFR inhibitor, and half of them did not, which is the standard. You get chemotherapy and then that's all. So the study was basically looking at the addition of an EGFR targeted therapy after surgery and after chemo. And it was specifically for people who had EGFR mutations. So it ranges based on the patient's ethnicity or the location, patient's smoking history, but it's maybe 15 to 20% of lung adenocarcinomas have EGFR mutations. And so those were the people that were on this study. And we knew from a few years ago that adding osimertinib after surgery and after chemo improved how long people could go without the cancer coming back, a really important endpoint, as we call it. But what we found out this year is that it not only improved that, it not only improved the time to the cancer coming back and prolonged it, it also helped people live longer. So that is a huge finding. We call that in our technical clinical trials speak, overall survival. It helped people live longer and probably also helped more people be cured, which is absolutely the most important thing in an early stage trial where we're really trying to improve cures, get rid of cancer for more people. So that was a huge finding. It was in our big session of the conference called the plenary session.
I think it's sort of it did sort of jumpstart this whole thought process around specifically people with known biomarkers how might we look at treating in the neoadjuvant or adjuvant setting, or even, in both, in order to improve on those survival rates even more. We know this is specific to EGFR, I guess is what I'm saying. And I know a lot of you in the room and a lot of you online might have a biomarker driven cancer that's not specific to EGFR, but the good news is that we're looking at it in other targets as well. It's really exciting, and I think one of the most disheartening things for me personally, and as a lot of you know, I've been in this space for, a better part of 2 decades now. And 2 decades ago, there was not a lot, if anything, going on in lung cancer, particularly as it related to personalized medicine or targeted therapies or immunotherapies. I think EGFR was in trials back then, and it has literally exploded. And a lot of that explosion has happened in the later stage disease, but now we're seeing a lot of this really exciting stuff happen in early stage. So with that, I want to jump to immunotherapy, because at ASCO, they also showcased a number of studies on how to best use immunotherapy to treat early stage cancers. Can we talk a little bit about that?
There's been several studies in the last couple of years trying to figure out how to best use immune therapy in early stage cancer. So that means stages 1, well, not as much 1, but mostly stages 2 and 3. And so again, it's, patients who are eligible for surgery where they can have the tumor removed, lymph nodes removed. Can we add immune therapy either before surgery or after surgery, or both, as you were saying before, perioperatively? And so there's been several studies now that we've seen, and there's a few approvals, FDA approvals, where we're using this as part of standard of care now, either before surgery or after surgery. And so now we have at ASCO a couple of other studies that we saw that are trying to fine tune this even better, really trying to figure out who might be benefiting, what the best strategy is. Is it giving it before? Is it giving it after? Or is it giving it both? And so it's actually an amazing time where we're seeing almost every study is really showing benefit, where we're improving how well patients are doing if they get immune therapy added on. The confusing part now is which is the best strategy, before, after, or both. And that's the part that we don't really know yet, because none of these studies have compared the different strategies to each other.
Yeah, and I think that's sort of my unintended cue to give a shout out to clinical trials in general, but more importantly, people who participate in them, because without you, the people participating, these discoveries wouldn't happen. And so, again, a huge shout out and a thank you to all of you who have participated, who have yet to participate, or who are thinking about participating. As we talked, about this leading up to this meeting, there's a lot of important patient questions that still sort of remain when we're thinking about early stage lung cancer. There's a lot of challenges around diagnosing lung cancer earlier. A lot of challenges around what the current criteria is for screening, and not just the criteria, but then actually getting people in to get screened. And I think there's a lot of exciting things on the horizon that are happening there as well. So let's shift to late stage. We saw new information from targeted therapy trials focused on several different driver mutations. And I think maybe since we sort of started in the early stage with EGFR, how about we start there? Dr. Goldberg, can you tell us a little bit about what's happening in that space?
Sure. So this is one of the topics that I do a lot of research in, both clinical trials and trying to understand EGFR cancers better. And so as you mentioned before, we've known about the EGFR mutation for 20 years now almost. And so there's been drugs that have benefited people who have EGFR mutation positive lung cancer for 20 years, but we're getting better and better. So there's like next generations of drugs that have really helped us. And now again, we're trying to fine tune this. And so there were a couple of studies at ASCO that I think really have helped us figure out how to best treat our patients. One of the studies I think that was really, really important for us as we're figuring out treatments for people with EGFR cancers was the study called Keynote 789. So this is actually not looking at an EGFR inhibitor. It's basically looking at what do you do after the EGFR inhibitor therapy kind of wears off, when the cancer starts growing again. We really don't know the best treatment then. There's a lot of different options. Chemotherapy is often part of the treatment after the EGFR therapies, but the big question is, do you add immune therapy to that, right? Immune therapy, as we just talked about, has been a huge part of our treatment for several years, but is it appropriate for people with EGFR cancers? We really had no idea until now. And so this study, basically half the people got immune therapy with their chemo and the other half got chemo alone. And I was really excited for these results because, again, it's something we face all the time in clinic, which is the better treatment. And what this study showed is really there was no difference. So it didn't seem to benefit people when they got the additional drug. And that's huge because, you sometimes start to think, oh, more is better. You really want to treat the cancer as many drugs as you can, or as aggressive as you can, but that's not always the case. And this is what I think the study shows us, is that even though pembrolizumab, that's the immune therapy that was used here, benefits so many people with lung cancer, in this situation, it doesn't seem to benefit people with EGFR positive lung cancer. And so I think it really shows us chemotherapy on its own is better than chemo with pembrolizumab, or Keytruda is the other name for it. I think there's still more questions. Like, we often are thinking, should we continue the EGFR therapy? Is there another drug to add to it that would be better? So still a lot of unknowns there, but at least we know that immune therapy with Keytruda is not beneficial when added to chemo in EGFR patients.
Given that sort of EGFR was the space within which we found the sort of OG targeted therapy drugs that ultimately got approved, we've had people on, these therapies for, better part of a decade, if not more at this point. And these are the folks out there that are like, okay, what's my plan B? What's my back pocket?
Right.
Obviously, osimertinib or Tagrisso came out and was a really important drug for this population, but it's sort of now this then what? So I know there's a lot of interest, particularly in the people diagnosed with lung cancer, with EGFR positive lung cancer, like, what is my next sort of thing? So thank you for sharing that. And I also think we've had discussions about this in the past, where the original sort of thought process around immunotherapy as it pertains to people with driver mutations is that one might not necessarily work with the other, and in this instance it sort of proved sort of that point. So now how do we move on to the next best sort of space? So apologies for interrupting, but please continue.
A couple other things just in the EGFR space that I think were really important. We're starting to now see that there may be other targeted therapies that benefit a specific type of EGFR mutation called EGFR Exon 20. So that's a group of people who have certain mutations in their cancer. It's EGFR, but it's pretty rare, but we see it sometimes, these Exon 20s. They don't tend to respond very well to our standard EGFR inhibitors. But fortunately now we have several drugs that are approved and a lot more that are under investigation. And at ASCO, we saw data for a drug called sunvozertinib, which again specifically seems to benefit people who have this Exon 20 EGFR mutation. And so the data look really, really promising. The study that we saw, the results from, was pretty small and it was still pretty early days, but I think it's really, really exciting. And there's actually several other drugs in development for EGFR Exon 20 that I'm excited about too. And we have some trials for this group of people at Yale, and I know there's a lot of other ones around the country and the world. And I think in the next few years, we're gonna see a lot more in this space too.
Yeah, I agree. And I think as if lung cancer weren't complicated enough, which is sort of this blessing and this curse, particularly for the patient population, trying to understand all of this is really challenging. Like, you've got EGFR, but then you've also got all these sort of subtypes of EGFR, Exon 20 being one of them. But as you stated, it's a really sort of exciting time even for that, population of folks diagnosed. One of the, I think, challenges with the earlier sort of targeted therapy drugs was the ability for these drugs to pass the blood-brain barrier and prevent and or treat, or help to prevent and or treat brain metastases. And there was an Everest trial that demonstrated a new targeted therapy. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, so this trial looked at a drug called EZD3759, or zorafertinib. So this drug, just as you were saying, was specifically developed to easily pass into the brain. So the technical term that we use is sometimes we say it's either brain penetrant or it crosses the blood-brain barrier. So a lot of our drugs that treat cancer don't get into the brain as well as they get into other organs. The brain tries to protect itself, and so some of our drugs don't get in as well. And unfortunately, brain metastases, or cancer that spread to the brain, are more common than we ever would want them to be in lung cancer. And so it actually is pretty important that our drugs do get into the brain. And so this drug, again, specifically was developed to be able to get into the brain. And this study compared the drug with our first generation of EGFR inhibitors, which is gefitinib or erlotinib. So those drugs, we don't tend to use them as much in the clinic anymore because now we have osimertinib. But this study, I think it was probably developed several years ago. And so that's why, I guess the way I think about it is the comparison is a bit outdated, right? I think a really nice study would be comparing it to osimertinib, but we have what we have. But this study showed that the AZD drug that penetrates into the brain better, people did better. And that's not that surprising because we know that brain metastases can happen at baseline, they can develop later on. And so what this tells us is a drug that gets into the brain is more likely to be better for people. And I think it's something we knew and we've seen in other studies, and this just confirms that. How this will fit into how we treat patients, I think, is a lot less clear because, again, osimertinib, our standard EGFR inhibitor, also gets into the brain very well. So would this have been better than that? We don't know. So it's something to understand and to acknowledge that these CNS penetrating drugs are really important for our patients with lung cancer. But I don't know that this is going to be something we necessarily use in clinic when we have osimertinib. But, again, something just to think about, and a drug that I don't think it's actually approved. It's not approved in the US. I'm not sure if it's approved elsewhere. But it's an interesting study to start to think about the importance of drugs that get into the brain.
Yeah, agreed. And I think there's one final study that I just want to touch on because I think it points back to what I was talking about earlier for folks who have been on a EGFR targeted therapy for long periods of time and have developed resistance, even to Tagrisso, like now, or osimertinib, like now what? And I think that's the BLU 945 study, which I think is in its early sort of data output stages, but I think it's an important one to sort of keep our eye on.
Yeah, I agree. So this is another EGFR inhibitor, kind of our next generation after osimertinib, where the study is looking at, can this be beneficial for patients even after osimertinib or after another EGFR inhibitor? They're also looking at in combination with osimertinib. And so I agree, this study looks really promising. I think it's something that we will see more of in the coming years, and hopefully we'll be able to understand how to best use it. Is this going to be the kind of drug that we use after osimertinib? Do we use it instead of osimertinib, in combination? I think there's still a lot of questions, but it does look like a really promising drug. I agree.
Perfect, thank you. I think we have a question from the online audience. Michelle, I'm going to shift to you.
Do the EGFR exon 20 insertion deletion results hold true for exon 20 point mutations?
Oh my goodness, that is a very good question. So exon 20 insertion mutations are rare, but the point mutations are even more rare, at least as the de novo mutation. Is that what you're talking about, when it's the initial mutation found in the cancer at diagnosis?
Yes.
Before you explain that, can you explain what you just said?
What that is? Yes. Yeah. Good. Thank you for asking. Yes. So when we talk about mutations, basically what we're talking about is changes or abnormalities in the DNA. And EGFR is the name of a gene, and there's different parts of the EGFR gene, just like there's different parts of every gene, and the different parts are called exons. Okay, so the most common EGFR mutations are abnormalities in either exon 19 or exon 21. We're talking about exon 20, so the one right in the middle. And that's the challenging group typically, because those are the ones that the standard drugs haven't been effective, but now we're getting more and more drugs, like I was saying before. And so within exon 20, the most common alterations are these insertions, which basically mean basically extra DNA is in there and makes it abnormal. But you can also get a point mutation, which is like a switch, like one piece of DNA becomes a different piece. And it's just basically different ways DNA can become mutated. But for whatever reason, I don't know that anybody understands why, within exon 20, usually we find mutations, but occasionally we find point mutations. And so because they're so rare, I am not sure that we know about these new drugs and whether the point mutations are going to be as sensitive. But based on what we've seen with other drugs, they very well could be. And I think that may just be something that with time, we're going to get more and more data on. Because, these rare mutations are really tricky because they're rare and they're hard to study because you don't see them very often. And so EGFR exon 20 alterations are rare enough, but then the point mutations are even more rare. So I think there may be some data out there that I'm just not familiar with this drug, with sunvosertinib. But I'm sure with time we'll get more data on that so that we can better understand the activity of that drug and others in EGFR exon 20 point mutations. But it also goes to your point earlier about the benefit and the importance of research, right? Like without people with these mutations going on these studies and trying these drugs, which very well might help them, we wouldn't know anything about how they work. So hopefully in the next months and years, we'll know more.
Yeah, I agree. Sort of one of our mottos here at GoTo is every person's cancer is their cancer, and we don't know what we don't know, right, until we know. So yeah, I couldn't agree more. I want to jump to KRAS. So I remember when I, again, first started in this space, and EGFR was this sort of identified, piece that had a targeted therapy. When we looked at what we knew back then, KRAS took up the biggest piece of the pie. And over the last few years, 2, 3 years, don't quote me on that, COVID really messed up my timelines for time in general. But we had some really exciting news in KRAS, and I think we're continuing to find exciting things happening in that space. Can we start, Dr. Goldberg, talking about the Scarlet trial?
Yeah, so I guess just by way of background, just to go off of what you were saying, we haven't had targeted therapies for KRAS ever, right? This is the most common mutation that drives the cancer in lung cancer, in a lot of cancers, and we haven't had a targeted therapy for years. Now we have 2 that are approved. They've shown benefit in trials, and they got FDA approved in the last couple of years. It's really exciting because, again, we haven't had anything for people, any targeted therapies for people with KRAS. They're specifically for KRAS G12C. So now that I've already given you the lesson on DNA, we can talk about what that means. Basically, KRAS is, again, it's a gene, but it can have a lot of different mutations. And G12C is a specific point mutation that occurs in KRAS. And it's actually one of the most common, maybe it's the most common in KRAS in lung cancer. Anyway, the 2 drugs that are approved, one is called adagrasib and one is called sotorasib. Those are approved, they've shown benefit, and they're available for patients off of trials. But now there's a lot of trials trying to, again, improve on that. So adagrasib and sotorasib are beneficial for a lot of people, but not for everyone. Sometimes they don't work at all. And a lot of times when they work, the effect wears off sooner than we want. Some people do fantastically well for a long time, but they don't tend to be as good as a lot of our other targeted therapies for like EGFR and other alterations. So now there's a lot of studies trying to improve on sotorasib and adagrasib, and also to develop other KRAS inhibitors. So the Scarlet trial, to answer your question with that background, the Scarlet trial was basically trying to do that. It was trying to improve on sotorasib by giving it with chemotherapy. So the idea is chemotherapy can work very well in some people with lung cancer. Sotorasib can work well with people with lung cancer, and what if we combine them? And so basically they were showing that it can actually be very effective. Most people are benefiting from that combination, and some of them, again, are benefiting for a long period of time. The challenge, again, here, like I was saying before with these other EGFR studies, is it looks really promising, but is this appropriate? Is this better than giving one and then the other? And then what about immune therapy? It wasn't really part of the study. So I think this is giving us really great information that people can tolerate the combination. It's not dangerous. Most people are doing well with it. And now we have to figure out how to best use it. And that really requires randomized studies where half the people are getting one thing, half the people are getting another thing, and then we compare to see which one is best. In our randomized studies, any of our studies in oncology, we never give people nothing. That would be very unethical and terrible. But I think we need these kinds of studies now where, let's say, some people get the chemotherapy with the sotorasib and some people just get the sotorasib, or whatever the design is, where we can figure out if the chemo is adding anything. But I think it's great to see these kinds of studies because it starts the process of figuring out, is this the best treatment for people?
Yeah, I love that. And for anyone who might have missed last month's living room, where we had Dr. Karen Renkamp come and talk to us about clinical trials, it was sort of this clinical trials sort of 101, but on steroids, really kind of taking it to the next level and explaining what we mean by the different types of trials that are available. If you did miss it, please either reach out to us for the link or you can go on our website to find information about what that means. So sticking with KRAS for a little bit, also G12C, code break 200. What do we have going on there?
Yeah, so Codebreak 200, so this is one of the types of studies, like I was saying before, where we're comparing, we're randomizing people, where half the people are getting one thing, half the people are getting the other. And so in this case, this is from a few years ago. This was one of the original studies of sotorasib. So it was just using sotorasib, comparing it to our standard second-line chemotherapy, docetaxel. So half the people got one, half the people got the other. And we already knew the results of the studies. It's this study, it's been published and it's over, which is basically, it shows that people who got sotorasib had a longer, what we call progression-free survival. So basically time that their cancer was under control. So, you know, sotorasib is now approved and it does improve progression-free survival, which is important. What this study at ASCO is showing us is it's specifically looking at people who have cancer in the brain, so brain metastases, and trying to get a sense of, does sotorasib help to control the disease in the brain? And it looks really promising. You know, the study's a little hard to interpret in that regard because people were required to get radiation or other treatments to their brain metastases before they went on. So it was hard to know for sure what the sotorasib was doing. But basically, people seem to do just as well in the brain as they did in the body, which basically kind of tells you that it's doing something good in the brain. And they also found that the intracranial, so the brain disease control was better with sotorasib than with the docetaxel. So I do think this is telling us that sotorasib is working in the brain. Is it the best drug for brain metastases? We're not sure. Can it work to shrink brain metastases so we don't need the radiation? I don't think we could say that yet. So there's still more we need to understand, but it is showing a signal that it can work in brain metastases.
Great, and one more to talk about in KRAS till we move on to our next mutation.
Yeah, the contrast study.
Yes, thank you.
I know it's not actually a complicated word because it's just contrast, but they start it with a K.
And it's and it's not even just the K, it's the uppercase and it's the lowercase. Like, what do they want me to do here? Yeah.
It took me a while to figure that one out too. Yeah, they're trying to be cute, I think. So so the contrast O2 study. So this is a study looking at another KRAS inhibitor. So like I said before, sotorasib and adagrasib are approved, and again they help a lot of people, but I think we probably can do better either by combining them with something else or maybe a different KRAS inhibitor. And so this is one of the other KRAS inhibitors that's being developed. The name of the drug, it's still early, so it's just letters and numbers as far as I know. It's JDQ443. And so it's another KRAS G12C inhibitor. So again, it's the same types of people we're treating, the ones who have lung cancer with this KRAS G12C mutation. It looks really promising. It looks like it has activity. It looks really like it may be maybe even more tolerable, less side effects than the other ones. It's hard to tell for sure, but it does look like it has activity. So I think this is a drug that we need to keep an eye on and see how it will compare as the studies move along, but it is promising. There's other ones too. There's actually several KRAS inhibitors that are in development and they also look promising. This is one of the ones that was presented at ASCO, but there are a couple now that are being developed and I'm excited to have different options hopefully to have different options for patients and to really have a whole bunch that are in trials so that we can figure out which one is the best for people.
And I know we didn't necessarily talk about this beforehand, but G12C is just one sort of subtype. Are there other things going on in KRAS that are maybe just too early to maybe have the conversation now?
Yes, so there are. There's actually been a ton of KRAS research over the years, just we haven't had any success until now. But I think now with this success, there's a lot going on in other parts of KRAS. So there's specific targeted therapies for other KRAS mutations that are being developed, G12D, others. They're very early in trials. I know at Yale, we're just kind of getting these up and running and they're kind of just starting and getting going at other sites too. And then there's other drugs that are more broadly trying to treat KRAS, either specifically treating KRAS or targeting other parts of the pathway that KRAS signals through. So there's really is a lot going on in this space because you're right, G12C is just one type of KRAS mutation and there's a lot of others and we need therapies for those too.
Okay, ROS1, you guys ready to jump into ROS1? Early results from the Trident-1 trial. Can we talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so ROS1 is another alteration in lung cancer. It's a pretty rare one, just like a couple of % of lung adenocarcinoma. And we have a couple of great drugs for ROS1 that are approved. We have crizotinib and entrectinib. But again, just like with the other mutations, these drugs are not curing people. They're not getting rid of the cancer. And in a lot of people, they're working for years, but for a lot of people, they're also wearing off after a couple of years, and then we need something better. And so there's a group of drugs now being studied, and repotrectinib is one of them. Repotrectinib can actually target a few different mutations, but the Trident-1 study was specifically looking at ROS1. And so they looked at a couple of different things with this drug. They looked at people who've never gotten any ROS1 inhibitors, and then they looked at people who've gotten ROS1 inhibitors and progressed, the cancer progressed, and then they got the drug. And then they specifically were looking at brain metastases. Because like I said before, a really important part of cancer, lung cancer, is making sure it can work in the brain. So this drug looks really good. It looks like it can work extremely well when it's used as the original drug, when someone hasn't gotten another targeted therapy yet. Whether it will be better than our current drugs, not clear yet. It hasn't been compared, but it's really promising. And then it also looks like it may work in some people, not everyone, but in some people, even after the other targeted therapies have worn off. And so I think that's almost more exciting, right? Like when we use a targeted therapy, it works really well, and then cancer starts to grow. What do we do next? This may be an option in the future. And then it does look like it works in the brain, which wasn't surprising because we knew it got into the brain. And so that's always great to see. So this looks like a great drug, and hopefully we'll have it available for our patients in the future.
Great. Now I want to jump over and talk about BRAF, specifically for the very patient person online who has been waiting to talk about that. And can we talk a little bit about the Pharos trial, and then if he or she has any questions, we'll be happy to answer them.
So again, like I keep saying, BRAF is another mutation in lung cancer. So again, it's just a few % of lung cancer, lung adenocarcinoma specifically. And there's actually a lot of different BRAF mutations that we sometimes find in lung cancer. The most common is V600E. And fortunately, BRAF V600E mutations can be targeted with drugs that we have. And actually, BRAF V600E is very commonly found in melanoma. And so there's been targeted therapies for that for years. And so a couple of years ago, a combination of drugs was approved for BRAF V600E called dabrafenib and trametinib. And now what this study is showing is a different combination using the BRAF drug encoraging with trametinib. And so this is just a different combination of BRAF inhibitor and MEK inhibitor, trying to see if this may be beneficial for people with BRAF V600E mutations. And it does look like it is effective. The response rates were really high, especially when it was used as the initial therapy. And I think this drug it's not approved for lung cancer. Maybe it will be at some point, I'm not sure. But it's something that can be, maybe in the future we'll see it. And actually, I just want to change one thing I said, which is this study did use encorafenib and a different MEK inhibitor called binimetinib. So it's actually a different BRAF inhibitor and a different MEK inhibitor. And so again, it looks promising. How we'll use this in our patients where we already have a combination of drugs, I'm not sure. I don't think this study looked at people who previously got dabrafenib and trametinib to see if it would be effective, but probably not because they're very similar drugs. But the results do look really, really good.
Thank you so much. And we're going to jump into immunotherapies in a second. I think the sort of the standing theme, as we've been talking in the targeted therapy realm anyway, is combinations. And I know we get a lot of questions from folks who are considering some of these combination studies around side effect profiles and quality of life. Is there anything you can or would like to say about how people are sort of faring in this combination therapy space?
Yeah, that's a great question, especially when it comes to trials, because for a lot of these mutations, especially, we have great options not on a trial, right? Like, so, you might think, well, I can just get a drug off of a trial. Why would I do a combination on a trial? But the thing about the combinations, and, we don't know until we do the studies to know whether this is true for every combination. But the idea with a combination is, first of all, it might have more activity. It might work better. And the best thing for quality of life is to control cancer, right? If a drug works or a drug combination works better and works longer, that's going to be the best thing for quality of life. I mean, obviously, if there's terrible toxicity, terrible side effects, then no. But if there's a combination that doesn't have overwhelming side effects, but works better and works longer, that's going to be a win. And then the other funny thing, and this is something that's unusual for BRAF, but actually the combination of the two targeted therapies for BRAF seems to actually be better in terms of side effects than the single BRAF inhibitor. So sometimes combinations are actually better because something about the way that they work together is actually more tolerable for people. So I think, you have to do these studies and really, we have to do these studies to really know for sure what the side effects look like and whether it's helping people more than it's hurting people. Of course, that's always our goal. But I think it very well could be that the combination studies are going to help more than the single drugs, especially when there's a really good rationale. And we always do the lab science first, where we study it in the lab and we really try to make sure it looks promising in the lab before we treat people. So if it's a combination that looks really promising, and I think it's important to try it, even if it may increase the side effects somewhat.
Perfect, thank you. I just wanted to touch on it, like I said, because we do get a lot of questions around folks who are concerned about toxicity and the like.
Could I say one other thing about that too? Because I think it's such an important point. The thing I always tell my patients about side effects on trials, especially, it's true off trials too, but especially on trials, if there's side effects that are not okay, either something that we're worried about as oncologists or that people are telling us, I don't like how I feel, this is affecting my quality of life, you can always stop the drugs, right? You could always stop the trial, decide you don't want to go ahead with it. You can always adjust doses. So just because someone starts on a trial or starts on a drug doesn't mean they're committed to that forever. So those are always, and it even says in the consent forms of every trial that it's, and I forget exactly the language they use, like it's not binding, you can always withdraw from the trial at any time. And we always try to make things tolerable for people, because if it's causing too many side effects and impacting quality of life, that is not helping you. So I think that's a key part of what we do as oncologists, is try to adjust things or change things or stop things if the side effects are just too significant.
And I want to jump into immunotherapy. Immunotherapy entered, this space, I don't know, 7-8 years ago, at least as approved. And again, COVID, don't quote me on those dates. But it's been a hot topic, and I know a lot of folks in particular have seen the direct-to-consumer ads that have been going on since the early approvals of immunotherapy, and everybody thinks they need to be on immunotherapy, which is not necessarily the case. But we do have a new immunotherapy drug sort of entering the market, and we talked a little bit, or not we, folks talked a little bit about that at ASCO as well, around the Choice 01 trial. Can we talk some about that?
Sure. So just like you said, we have seen a whole lot of really great data with immune therapy in the last couple of years. Mostly until recently, it's been in people with metastatic or stage 4 lung cancer. And so it's really become a standard of what we do now every day in people with stage 4 lung cancer. Who don't have a targeted therapy option as initial therapy. We are giving immune therapy in some way, shape, or form, whether it's on its own or in combination with chemo or combination immune therapy. That's a whole other topic. But in this study, it basically is a very similar study as we've seen several times already, but with a different PD-1 inhibitor. So this is a Choice 01 study. So it's with a PD-1 inhibitor called toripalimab. And it's a study similar to the chemotherapy plus pembrolizumab study and a lot of other ones we've seen, where they're basically looking at whether giving it with chemotherapy is better than giving chemotherapy alone. So again, I don't think anything necessarily new, except it's a different drug by a different company. But I think it just reinforces what we've now seen several times, which is that immune therapy can really help people with lung cancer. To just say it simply, how we best do this. Do we always give it with chemo? Do we sometimes give it alone? I think those are still things we're not quite sure of. There's other studies going on that will try to help us with that. But this shows us that giving immunotherapy with chemotherapy is better than chemo alone. And years ago, we used to just give chemo, and we really never do that typically anymore, except in specific situations. We're usually giving some form of immune therapy. And so this is just another one that now we have nice data for. I don't know how we're going to use it. I don't know. It's not approved in the US. I think this study was really done in Asia for the most part. So maybe it's going to be approved there. I'm not really sure how that part, the approvals are going to work, but it does show that immune therapy plus chemotherapy is beneficial, which we knew, and now it's reinforced.
Perfect. Now I want to jump into, I know, a question we get a lot around non-biomarker or IO-specific treatments, like what's available and what's sort of coming down the pike for those that don't qualify in those other two buckets. And I think some of you remember, I believe it was Dr. Joel Neal from Stanford, and this is one of the things he was sort of most excited about talking about, and we did get some data coming out of ASCO around it, and that's the antibody drug conjugates specific to the Tropion Long O2 study.
I am also very excited about this. So far today we talked about a lot of different targeted therapies, and then those are only beneficial if the specific mutation is present in the cancer. Then we talked about immune therapies, and so this is a totally different class of drugs. So this is a class of drugs called antibody-drug conjugates. The idea there is it's an antibody, so it's specifically going after something on the surface of the cancer cell, and then it's an antibody drug, so the drug is a chemotherapy, and the conjugate means they stuck them together. So the idea is we're delivering chemotherapy directly to the cancer cell. The antibody, what it specifically targets, varies from drug to drug. So in this case, with the Tropion Long O2 study, the drug is called datopotamab deruxtecan, which is specifically going after the target called TROP2. I hope that was clear. It's a little confusing. So TROP2 is found on the surface of a lot of different cancer cells, including lung cancer. And so the idea, again, is you have TROP2 on the surface of the cancer cells. You have this antibody that's stuck together with a chemotherapy, and the antibody finds those TROP2 proteins on the cancer cell and brings the chemo right to it. And the hope there is it works better and has less side effects because it's specifically going after the cancer cells. So like a smart chemotherapy. Mm-hmm. And so we've seen data with this drug. We've seen data with a couple of other TROP2 antibody drug conjugates as well. And there is activity, which means some people who get this drug with lung cancer do really well with it. The cancer shrinks and it can work very well, even on its own. And so basically what this study is now doing is it's trying to build on that. We know the drug can sometimes work on its own, but it doesn't always work. And so what if we start combining it with things? And so what should we combine it with? Well, this study, they're combining it with a very standard treatment, pembrolizumab or Keytruda, and chemotherapy. And so it's still early days for these types of combinations. And there's a lot of other studies looking at these combinations. But basically what they found is that the side effects were not overwhelming. They were able to treat people fairly, safely. And people did very, very well. Most people are benefiting from this combination. Again, just like I was saying before, when you see benefit, the question is always, is it better than the standard? Is it better than immune therapy alone? Is it better than chemoimmune therapy? And I think that's where we don't really know, because unless you do a comparison within the same trial, you really can't tell. But it does look promising, and there's a lot, I feel like I've said that about every single study, but there's a lot of promising things out there now. It does look promising. I think, this is moving forward in other trials, randomized trials, where they're trying to really figure out how to best use this drug. And those are the trials that are really going to tell us, should we be doing this in people standard of care?
Yeah, I think before we jump into the last thing, I think, I personally got to sit down with some of the folks who developed this and were running the study on this. But it makes me think of really innovative and futuristic sort of options or treatments for lung cancer. And, when we think about targeted therapy and drugs that have been developed that specifically target the mutation that's driving your cancer. When you think about immunotherapy, that is activating your own immune system to identify and target the cancer. This is something a little bit different in using, they call them tumor treating fields, and they use literally electricity. I got to touch and play with all this stuff, and I think the original studies were in brain cancer, and now they've moved specifically into non-small cell lung cancer. Can you talk a little bit, Dr. Goldberg, about that? It was really exciting for me just because it was something so completely different than what we've been talking about over the last, several years.
I agree. I'm telling you all these really exciting and fantastic advances, but we still need more, right? Like it's still not enough. And so I like this study too, because it's really thinking outside the box.
Yeah.
And so just like you said, it's basically electricity that's delivered, electric fields, as they say, that are delivered directly to the cancer cells. And so in lung cancer, they give people these things to wear on their chest. I wasn't part of the study, so I haven't actually seen this in play, but they showed pictures of it during ASCO, so I got to see it. Basically, they like stick these things on that deliver electricity to the chest. And in people who have brain cancer, they put it on their head. And so the idea is it like directly goes in and treats the cancer. And so the way that this study was designed was they were trying to see if this therapy, when you gave it with standard treatment, so chemotherapy or immune therapy, was it better than just the standard treatment of chemo or immune therapy alone? And so like basically on top of the things you already do, does this benefit to add it on? And this was a positive study. They found that actually people did better and lived longer when they got the tumor treating fields. So that's really, really great. I mean, obviously that's what we're always looking for. I think I think at first glance, I was like, oh, we're all going to be using this. I think you have to look a little bit deeper though, because it's a little bit of a tough study to interpret, because it was started so many years ago that our standard treatment has changed. Yeah. So they're basically, most of the people on the study, the tumor treating fields was combined with chemotherapy, and most of those patients never got immune therapy. And so how will this work in now current era where we're using immune therapy as initial therapy? Should we be using this as part of the initial therapy or saving it for second? So I almost feel like this study created a buzz and excitement around this, but I think still we're not really sure what to do with it. I think it is available. It's not approved for lung cancer, but it's available out there. So I don't know if it's going to be something that gets much uptake. It seems pretty cumbersome for people to wear these things, but I haven't actually seen it happening in person, so I don't know for sure. But it's, I think they're going to be doing more studies, and it's also something to be on the lookout for how things evolve over the next couple of years with this.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I had the benefit of meeting a lovely woman with brain cancer who has been using this, was part of the trials early on, and has still been using it. And so I got to see it sort of live and in person, and she couldn't have been more thrilled. There are some sort of and also things that are attached to it. There's a battery pack that's attached, although I can't remember how much it weighs, but it's very lightweight. And they have all these specially designed sort of carry things to, whether it's a backpack or a fanny pack. So they try to kind of fit every person's sort of lifestyle and personalities. And the chest wearable, it almost reminded me of like I don't want to say Star Trek, because that sounds, not only does that date me, but it just sounds, I don't know, but it's like a sticky pad, and I don't want to minimize this type of technology, because I think it's just sort of now emerging into this space by calling it a sticky pad, but I don't know what else to call it, with these little sort of dime or nickel sized, fairly flat, I don't know, electrical whatevers, and there's one on the chest, one on the back, and two sort of smaller ones on the side. And I think they said you change them out like every 3 weeks. But anyway, I was completely fascinated by it. I was very interested in the data. And to your point, Dr. Goldberg, it's just something sort of new and innovative and sort of outside of the box thinking when it comes to this. And Dr. Goldberg, I'm going to switch to you to see if you have any sort of final thoughts or hopeful takeaways for the folks watching tonight, or those who will come back and watch post live before we sign off.
I think there's a lot going on in ALK positive lung cancer, and others too. We only touched on a couple of things. There's RET, there's MET. I mean, there's so much. This is just a highlight. There's a lot going on. I think some of the drugs for ALK and others are now in development, so we don't have data yet. But hopefully next year, that's what we'll be talking about the huge advances there. There's just so much in all of these subsets. I always tell patients, and when I'm talking about what I do to people, I always say lung cancer is not lung cancer, it's lung cancers, right? You may think of it as one disease because it starts in the lung, but there's so many different subsets, and there's so many different types of drugs and things that are benefiting people, and really trying to figure out the biomarker, what's driving the cancer, and what can you target. And now with this new class of drugs, the antibody drug conjugates, that may be able to do that in a different way than we ever did before. It really is exciting times, and we're seeing a lot of really great progress. And then just one final thing, just going back to what we talked about originally, the early stage, right? Like so much of the advances have been in metastatic disease, and we're finally now seeing advances in earlier stage lung cancer, where our goal is to cure the cancer, have higher rates of cure. And that is just so critical. So I'm so thrilled. So we didn't talk that much about early stage disease tonight, but that's a huge area. And hopefully we'll see more and more of that in the next couple of years as well.
Could not agree more. And I think the way to move the needle forward is early detection is going to be key in this. Not only continuing advancements for treating late stage disease, but identifying and treating it early is going to be, like I said, a key for people diagnosed in the future. Dr. Goldberg, thank you so much for coming and talking with us tonight. We really appreciate it. And as you said, we touched on some highlights from ASCO, but I think the exciting thing is things are happening. The needle is moving, and planning and keeping yourself educated for those potential, next step plan, B, C, D, E, or F, or I don't know, X, whatever Rick might be on at this point. I think it's important because we know that there is hope in this room, and that the more educated you are on what your options may be if and when you need them, the better you're going to do. So thank you all for joining us tonight in the room, online, and the entire GoTo team for working tirelessly alongside not only me, but this community to help to, like I said, move the needle forward 9 billion times. I can't seem to think of anything else to say tonight, but it's pretty exciting. And then, of course, I have to acknowledge our supporters. Amgen, AstraZeneca, Boehringer Ingelheim, Bristol Myers Squibb, Daiichi Sankyo, Eisai Foundation Medicine, Genentech, Janssen Oncology, Merck, Mirati, Novartis, Novocure, Regeneron, Sanofi, and Takeda. Thank you all so much for providing the support and enabling us to continue to bring this information forward.
So I'll be brave if you're brave. I'll be brave, but only